Hey, it's Kiri. It is night 3 at our quilt retreat, and I have another demo we're going to rehash here for your reviewing pleasure, or if it's new to you, hope you enjoy. So our theme this year has been the pineapple block, but I knew pretty early on that I wanted to do something a little less than, or a little different from the traditional pineapple that's not everyone's cup of tea. So I was taking a look at the swirly pearly buttons, which has that traditional snail trail variation on the pineapple block. And what I ended up settling on for our quilt retreat is this Sweet Trails pattern from Canuck Quilter Designs. This is an interesting pattern. It has some of the elements of a traditional pineapple snail trail in that it spirals, but it's not it's not an exact pineapple. There's like a variation here, made it kind of a fun adjacent pineapple project without really being a true pineapple. So if you are interested in making some of these pineapple-like flower blocks for yourself, here are the tips and tricks I have for working with this pattern. First off, the instructions are at the same time both very detailed and also a little bit confusing in the order of them. So she's going to give you instructions to do things that you're not going to use for maybe 15 more steps. You're not going to see it build for a while. You've got to trust her process. And there are a couple of times where she throws things at you and you're thinking, wait, what? And then just right below it, she explains. So don't ever get scared. She gives very great detailed instructions for several elements. She has you strip piecing for these little 4-square units. It's a great technique. She has you doing a lot of half square triangles in the very beginning, and then you make a lot of flying geese. She gives you options for how to make these, like different techniques. She definitely uses my favorite, like she recommends my favorite technique, which is where you can make the 4 at a time. I use my Deb Tucker wing clipper ruler. It works out great. I will say these were perfect. When I squared them up, they were the perfect size to trim them and make them perfect squares. My flying geese units, the measurements they give in the pattern are just a hair smaller than I would typically cut. So if I wasn't following the cutting instructions first, I would have made them just slightly larger. I would have followed the Deb Tucker measurements with the wing clipper, just so I had enough space to cut them down and square them up a little more precisely. These absolutely work. It just would have been nice to have that little extra bit of wiggle room. Yes, I am covering up a lot of the details here. I'm sorry, I don't remember copyright law. That being said, her cutting instruction list in the beginning is incredibly detailed. It gives you the number of strips, how wide to cut them, how we're going to subcut that unit, or like the number we're going to give that unit, and the size. I will say I found a couple of errors. The errors did not make a whole lot of difference because when the numbers are different here, she has incredibly detailed instructions later in the pattern that she'll say, hey, this is this number, and she'll give you the letter block. She'll reiterate the size again. She repeats herself regularly so you can be very comfortable with what you are doing. Thankfully, all the cutting instructions that are wrong on the cutting instruction paper have you cut them a little bit large. So if you follow the cutting instructions and you don't realize, oops, meant to change that, when you get to that step in your block, you can trim it down 1/8 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch. It's not a big problem. The only two that I found were blocks B and H. So piece B, piece H, again, slightly large. Piece B, not to the point where it made any difference in my block. Piece H was a little bit large. Not so much that I couldn't use it, but definitely made my block a little awkward when I trimmed it down. My seams lined up better when I trimmed it down to the size she tells you later in the pattern, not on the cutting instructions. Let's start building a block. So we're going to start with one of our 4-patch units we made in the very beginning of the steps when we didn't know how this was going to fit into our block. And she tells you her trick for matching up because you're going to add these nice little corners on there. Her tip for this is to fold your corners in half, and she tells you to go ahead and fold your block in half too. I don't find this necessary because my block already has a beautifully marked halfway point. I don't need to fold it in half. It's right there. So I'm just going to rotate my block, because the other thing is, if we want this beautiful snail trail look, we need to be able to trace. We have our dark pink in the center, so I want this nice dark pink to be what spirals out. If I get this, if I get my starting row off, I end up with this, where yes, it looks good, but it's not quite right. It's really perfect. In a perfect world, this block should be here, and that would be the start of my spiral. My spiral here, is just a little wonky. Wait, it's fine, but we're going to try to keep our blocks here in a nice spiral. So I find it's easiest if I orient all of my blocks, keeping a white in my top left corner, and I always start with my dark that matches. If I'm starting with my white in my upper left corner, I'm going to put my darks on each side, to the left and the right. And again, just folding that, finding my nice center. I just literally lay it across the center here, and then I can unfold and just sew right across that seam. I've changed colors here for my sample, I'm sorry, but same thing. I've got my white in the upper corner, we put the darks here, and you can see the beginning of that snail trail is starting to form. We're going to continue to add corners, almost like an economy block. If this is a true pineapple, we'd be trimming after each row. We're not going to do that here. What's going to give it the nice sort of flowery rose effect is keeping that sort of point to it. So we would add corners. Again, you can see the block is growing. We have still there's the starting ones. Again, building that snail trail around. Stick your purple. I've kept my orientation the same, kept my purples going on first. And then yet again, we have, here's the whites, purple, 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 building. I have that nice snail trail going. It's almost like a Superman S. The pattern designer puts an entire half a page in her pattern and then reminds you step by step that she does not want you to trim on certain rounds. So on round 1, I trusted her process. It worked out just fine. Put on my corners, didn't trim. Round 2, she tells me it should be a nice 4.5-inch square. It pretty much was. Trimmed it with my nice fussy cut ruler. 3, she tells you again, hey, let's not trim this one. It's a weird size. Don't even go for it. And then for 4, you should have an 8.5-inch block, which I did. So 8.5 inches, we're ready for some leaves. And now we get to do the fun part where all of those flying geese units and half square triangles that I made in the beginning and didn't get to use right away, here they come into play. So there are good instructions for what direction to put them in, what order, and they line up so nicely with the sides of our spiral to make this into a gorgeous little flower block. It just comes straight together. It makes our pretty little rose. Sashing is also fun. It's where we get to use these nice green 4 patches we made in the beginning. Put them with these pieces that have just some half-square triangles on the end. Get some dark ones that'll attach in between the blocks, and it's just a really nice touch to the quilt. It finishes it so beautifully. This pattern has an option with your flower blocks for if you wanted to make a scrappy version and didn't want to buy yardage, how would you lay out just one block? There's a whole page dedicated to just cutting a single block. It's a great resource. That being said, it has you do, instead of using what I'm going to call the Deb Tucker method of making 4 flying geese at the same time, it switches you to a stitch and flip method. So we were talking today about how I tend to, when I see stitch and flip instructions at this point, I automatically, in my head, rewrite the pattern and turn it into this method because I don't want to stitch and flip and throw in my corners. Even if I only needed 2 flying geese units, I would rather have a bonus 2 flying geese hanging around than to have these corners I'm just going to throw in the trash can. And someone asked, how do you know if you have enough fabric? Excellent question. So for my flying geese unit, if I'm doing it the 4 at a time method, I have to cut 1 big blue square. If I was doing just 2 flying geese out of stitch and flip method, where you cut essentially this 4.5 by 2.5 inch triangle, and then I'm going to use this as the same size, another 4.5 by 2.5, right? This is how much fabric I need to cut 2 stitch and flips This blue is the size I need to cut for 4. If I have the yardage to cut these two, I have the yardage to cut this. I just have to be aware in advance. Like if it tells me to cut my fabric into strips, then I may not have the yardage for it. But as long as I'm thinking ahead of time before I cut anything, hey, I'm changing this element. Like this pattern, again, she's super detailed. She tells you right on there, I am giving you 3 to 5 spare inches of fabric so you can, for straightening, etc. If you want more, buy a little bit more. Like again, her stuff can be a little bit, like the order she puts it in is a little baffling at times. Very detailed though. The information is there if you can, you will eventually find it. So if I'm basically running so tight on fabric, I don't have this itty bitty little blue piece, I'm probably in trouble somewhere anyway. So the only other thing I would need for flying geese units, and this is true whether I'm making 2 with stitch and flip or 4 with the 4 at once method, are 4 white squares. And again, it's just 4 squares no matter which method it is. I will end up with a whole 2 extra flying geese out of just 4 squares here, this way, and then eventually this way. Or with the stitch and flip, of course, we put the littler ones on here, and then of course stitch and flip them up. These squares will be a little bit smaller, but again, we're talking very small amounts. Maybe about 1/4 of an inch. I didn't measure it, I'm sorry. But again, on 4 squares, 1/4 of an inch times 4 is 1 inch. If I'm cutting so tight I don't have an inch of give, I'm a little bit worried. Hopefully I've bought more fabric than that or have a little bit in my stash. So unless I'm making literally dozens or hundreds of flying geese, I do not worry in a pattern that has 10, even 20 of them switching from this method to this method. So much less waste. I'm much happier with the product here. And I don't worry about fabric. It's the amount of difference of fabric it takes is minuscule. So I hope that little mini quilt class crash course was helpful in little ways, and that if you decide to give this pattern a try, you share your photos with us because we love quilting show and tell.